This is a very fun step. Sometimes people just skip right to this. They start their website redesign with design, which, as you can see, I've described these other steps. It's very important not to do that. So design is all about kind of planning the look and the feel. So the number one sort of mistake we see, especially if you skip those earlier steps, say you skipped wireframing or you skipped site mapping, the number one problem we see with redesigns is actually over design. It's actually putting way too many design elements into a site and just kind of overdoing it. That actually happens a lot. So the wireframes, now you have your sort of framework and structure. You know where things are going to do, and you can start designing things. You can start figuring out your photos, your colors, other things like that. And the audience first approach applies to design too. Think about what your audience likes, what they expect, what will resonate with them, and build your design around that. A major first step is color. So usually your brand colors are going to be the accents, typically. Most of the time, brand colors are much bolder than kind of neutral colors or grayer colors. You know, typical nonprofit brands can have kind of bold colors. So don't overdo those. That won't work well for many reasons. For accessibility reasons, readability, and all kinds of other things. So typically the brand colors are going to be accents. And if your brand doesn't have some really good neutral colors, part of your style guide already built in, consider maybe creating some complementary neutral tones you can use based off the brand colors. So a very common question we always get is, what should we make links or buttons? What is going to make people click on the most? And really, it's not a specific color. The most effective thing for a link or a button is actually contrast. It really doesn't matter what color. The contrast is very important, and that it never changes, that it's consistent. You know, if you have buttons in 10 different colors, that's going to confuse people for sure. Another important thing, like I talked a little bit about accessibility, before you settle on some colors, I highly recommend you test them. And this is a tool, WebAIM. If you just go to webaim.org, they have many, many tools for building websites on there. A great tool they have is a font testing tool and a color testing tool, where you can plug in the colors you're going to use and see if they will meet the minimum contrast standards, if they'll meet accessibility standards. So that's very important. So we got a question, some more questions about color. So I'll answer those super quick since we're in the color section. And remember, we will have dedicated Q&A at the end. I'll save some time for that. We have a question: if your organization doesn't have an existing color scheme, how do you recommend finding one? Well, actually, I'm going to go into another step just in a minute, which will show some of that thought process. But if you don't have an existing color scheme at all, I would really highly recommend you start at those prerequisite steps I talked about. Build a really good brand style guide. You can hire contractors to help you with that, or work with an agency like us, or even go to one of those design websites where you can kind of hire a designer. But definitely have that first. Don't embark on a huge website redesign process without at least some kind of minimal style guide. So build that guide out. And how to choose colors, choose them basically audience first is kind of the whole idea, right? Audience first design. Figure out what color resonates with the audience you're trying to communicate with. You know, if you just have no idea at all, or don't have a preference for those colors, brand colors, you know, check out your audience and kind of figure out what's going to really resonate with them. Well, I had a question about color consistency, color over the entire site. Color consistency over the site is pretty important. That's a pretty important thing, especially when it comes to buttons and links. However, you may want to have, say, one very standout thing. Like, let's say you have buttons and links and navigation and colors, and it's all kind of similar. But let's say the main driver of your website is you're trying to get donations. That donation button, that could be in a different color. Say that's on your header, big donate button, or a big contact, or volunteer, or like one main action. To have that stand out and be a different color is probably fine. That could actually help. Recommend changing your logo periodically. That is really a question of, I guess, how is it aged, really? Some logos are kind of timeless. FedEx, IBM, you could think of a lot of major ones, although they do get updated every maybe 20, 30 years. They'll get a slight tweak. So I would say look at, does your logo and just your branding overall in general, does it match your current mission? Does it match your current audience? If it resonates with what you're trying to do right now, it's fine. But if it hasn't, if it's drifted a little bit, if it's a little bit long in the tooth, then an update could be definitely worthwhile. The next thing to consider when you're talking about sort of setting up your style and design stuff is the typography. Typography is actually pretty important. It's very important not only how it looks, but it actually has a big determination on how people use your site. You can use typography to designate buttons or links in kind of one type. You can use it to define a hierarchy, what's a header, what's more detailed content. It's really important, and use those consistently. Usually we say like no more than 3 fonts, and we're not including your logo. Your logo many times can be totally custom or custom font, but really 2 to 3 fonts is what you want to use. And you want to make sure you're using fonts that are going to be widely supported web fonts. So this is a screenshot of Google Fonts. Google Fonts is a great resource. They pretty much are all going to work in the web. And then your designers, they can download the fonts. You can even actually choose in the wireframe stage if you already have your typography figured out. Say you have an existing brand guide, having that real type in the wireframes is kind of nice to see too. So you can kind of see that hierarchy. So Typekit, which is now Adobe Fonts, Google Fonts, those are kind of the 2 best ones. And if you pick these fonts, your designers doing mockups can use the same fonts, and the web browser will use the same fonts. It will be very consistent and look nice. The imagery, kind of developing imagery is the next step. What kind of imagery are we going to use? The imagery can help really create a more of an emotional connection. And again, think about your audience. Use relatable. Pick relatable imagery that relates to your audience, that will resonate with them. And use original photography whenever possible. So this is just a small chunk of a website. It's not the whole website, but 2 photos there we actually took ourselves, and one of them's a stock image. So, if you use your real staff or real people or your real volunteers or whatever, the authenticity will come through. Unfortunately, if you have to use lots and lots of stock photography, you'll kind of start seeing the same photos used over and over again on a lot of sites. So that's kind of a bummer. That's a big stock photography now is very, very cheap and easily accessible, which is good, but you can overdo it. And if you go down the route of maybe using some stock photography, Getty images or whatever, or Adobe images, just make sure for sure that you are browsing the royalty-free section, because there's a big difference. Royalty-free imagery is going to be some cheap flat price, $10, $20, whatever, or it may be a subscription, $30 a month, and you could download 100 images. That's that royalty-free area. Most of those sites also have what's called rights managed, and those photos you could have to pay thousands of dollars to use. Because they'll only sell them to you. So don't look at that stuff. Stick to the royalty free if you go down the stock photography route. So this is kind of the last sort of full mock-up design step, is kind of creating these style tiles. Not necessarily maybe 100% needed, but very, very, very valuable. This will help you plan out in more fidelity, more depth, how your style you've been planning on is going to translate to the real full website. How are the colors used together? How is the imagery used? Are we using some images as background images, some as foreground images, or how are the colors going to designate different areas of the site? So creating these is really useful, and you can keep them as a reference, use them as a reference to further the design down the road. A couple more questions actually in this section about kind of fonts and stuff. Can you import fonts into your WordPress? You don't necessarily import them. So say you're using an Adobe font or you're using a Google font. There's actually a special line of code that whoever develops and builds the website, they put this line of code in your site, and that is going to include that font. It's part of what's called your style sheet or your CSS. So that's kind of how these different fonts get into the website. So it's not really, you don't really import files that way. Best practice to incorporate website redesigns with marketing print materials. Yes, there definitely is. And this step we're looking at right now, the style tiles, could be used for both, actually. If you create a really great, robust set of style tiles, you could really, in theory, use those for both print materials and website. You could use them for mobile apps or even actually social media, all kinds of things. The style tiles is really where your fonts, colors, and imagery culminate. So this is actually a great place if you decide to build that out. If we're doing a very robust redesign for a larger client, typically we will develop a PDF document, an entire PDF document that they can keep and reference, and that will be full of these style tiles and different kind of style design ideas, right? And then they can hand that off to their advertising people or their print people or whoever designers they're working with can all work from that. And that's what gets you really consistent feel sort of across your website, social, print, whatever. So now we're into the full mockups, and this is a high fidelity, full Photoshop mockup of exactly what a page will look like using the fonts, the right size font, the color, everything, and it's a 1-to-1 pixel exact representation of the site. Of course, it doesn't kind of move and expand like sites do. It's not responsive. It's a flat image, but it's really cool because it gives you the real feel of what the site's going to look like. So typically we don't do, every page like that would not be cost effective because this is a labor intensive step, but we'll do the home page for sure. We'll do any major landing page. We may do the contact page or the donation page. We'll do kind of those big, important pages. And now we're going to get into kind of how you integrate the content into now your site. So you've created those full mockups, and developers now have taken those mockups and they have turned them into a test site, right? Like a development site in WordPress or whatever, where you're now starting to integrate in the content. You're starting to enter in the content. So remember to continually refer to the strategy, the audience, personas, the page briefs, all that strategy you built in the other steps as you are creating the pages and putting it into your CMS. Make sure you keep referring to that, because the worst thing is when you make a really good plan and then no one ever looks at it again. So make sure you look at it.